You already know jerk chicken. You think of it as Jamaican. And it is. But the two ingredients that define jerk seasoning, allspice and scotch bonnet pepper, were on this island thousands of years before anyone called it Jamaica. Before Columbus landed in 1494, before the Spanish, before the British, before the slave ships. The flavor you call Caribbean is, at its core, a Taíno flavor, belonging to a people who were reduced from an estimated 60,000 on Jamaica alone to near extinction within 30 years of first contact with Europe. The people who invented this food were nearly erased from history. The food survived. When you pull back the lens, what you find on a Caribbean plate, allspice, Scotch bonnet, tamarind, curry, is not random. It is a map. A physical record of every empire that raced to control the world's most valuable trade routes, each one leaving its flavors behind. 5 empires, 5 centuries, one chain of islands sitting directly in the path of the winds that made the entire Atlantic world possible. The answer will take you from the Orinoco River Valley to the Blue Mountains of Jamaica, from the ports of West Africa to the rice paddies of Bihar, from a German army surgeon in Venezuela to an underground cooking pit designed to leave no smoke. To understand why Caribbean food is what it is, start with the wind. The trade winds are east to west prevailing winds through Earth's equatorial region. Portuguese navigators recognized their importance in Atlantic crossing as early as the 15th century. Once European sailors understood the pattern, the Caribbean became the essential hub of the Atlantic world. Every colonial fleet, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, English, French, funneled through the same corridor. The Taíno, whose ancestors entered the Caribbean roughly 2,500 years ago, traced their origins to Arawak-speaking peoples from the Orinoco River Valley in Venezuela. They migrated northward through Trinidad and the Lesser Antilles, carrying cassava, maize, sweet potato, peppers, pineapple. They also carried a cooking technique, drying and smoking meats over a raised wooden frame they called a barbacoa. Food historians broadly agree that all forms of barbecue worldwide evolved from this Taíno practice. The word barbecue is Taíno, so are hurricane, canoe, hammock, and tobacco. They called the island Zaimaca, meaning land of wood and water. An early empire in itself, agricultural societies ruled by caciques, growing food, making cassava bread on fire-heated ceramic griddles called buren, keeping stock pots simmering with meat, fish, and vegetables. By 1516, the Spanish historian Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés documented how the Taíno prepared meats using native hot peppers and pimento. But the Caribbean's geographic centrality meant it could not stay isolated. Old World diseases reduced the indigenous population of the Americas by an estimated 80 to 95%. On the island of Hispaniola alone, a population probably numbering at least 500,000 fell to fewer than 500 by 1526. The allspice trees kept fruiting. And the history of Caribbean food becomes, from this point, the story of what poured into that vacuum. To understand how jerk's flavor survived the near destruction of the people who invented it, you have to go to the mountains. In 1655, English forces invaded Jamaica and defeated the Spanish. The Spanish freed their enslaved Africans who fled into the mountainous interior. The Blue Mountains, the cockpit country. They became the first Jamaican Maroons. The word maroon comes from the Spanish cimarron, wild, untamed. The Maroons intermingled with surviving Taíno, learned the practice of jerking, and carried the technique through decades of guerrilla war against the British. In those hills, a woman named Nanny. Born around 1686, Asante, from present-day Ghana, taken into slavery by the British. Under her leadership, the Windward Maroons waged a guerrilla campaign the British could not suppress. Their tactics included camouflage, stealthy fires, and deliberately leaving survivors after ambushes, always leaving someone alive to carry fear back to British forces. A treaty signed on 20 April 1740 granted her people 500 acres in Portland, a village called Moortown, still standing today. Over 30 years, Nanny was credited with freeing more than 1,000 enslaved people. Her face is on the Jamaican $500 note. She is the only woman among Jamaica's national heroes. What made her community's survival possible was the cooking pit. The Maroons used underground fires for jerk, because underground fire leaves no visible smoke. Smoke rising through the forest canopy reveals your position to soldiers hunting you. The cooking technique was simultaneously a preservation of Taíno culinary heritage and an active military tactic. The food kept the community alive. Here is the receipt. The 1739 British treaty with Cudjoe's Leeward Maroons granted 2,500 acres in the cockpit country, plus political autonomy. The British Empire negotiated formal recognition of a community of formerly enslaved people, whose food was kept invisible by design. The cooking method and the political survival were the same act. The Atlantic slave trade transported approximately 12.75 million Africans onto ships bound for the Americas. Up to 2 million died during the crossing. Disease ecology drove this. Sub-Saharan Africans had greater resistance to malaria and yellow fever than Europeans, making Africa-sourced slavery more economically profitable in tropical climates. On the plantations, enslaved Africans were sometimes allowed to work provision grounds, small plots of unused estate land where they grew eddos, yams, plantains, and cocoyams, selling surplus in local markets. The national dish of Jamaica, ackee and saltfish, emerged from this period. Ackee, native to West Africa, arrived on the slave ships. Saltfish was salted cod, Portuguese in origin. Jamaica's national dish is a fusion of a West African fruit and Portuguese preserved fish, born in the kitchen of slavery. Then slavery was abolished in 1834. The Indian indenture system followed. Historian Hugh Tinker called it a new form of slavery. Between 1874 and 1917 alone, more than 94,000 Indian laborers arrived in Trinidad, the majority from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. They brought curry, turmeric, roti, chana. The colonial government in Trinidad, unlike other colonies, offered land grants to laborers who completed their indentures, 5 acres and 5 pounds cash, which is why so many stayed. By the 2011 census, Indo-Trinidadians were the largest ethnic group in Trinidad at 35.43%. The spice routes didn't arrive in the Caribbean on galleons. They arrived in the bodies and memories of people who had no choice about the journey. The Caribbean's flavors were shaped not only by whose hands grew the food, but by what those crops were worth. Sugarcane was introduced to the British West Indies by Dutch traders from Brazil in the mid-17th century. By 1796, Jamaica was producing up to 66% of the British Empire's sugar. Out of sugar came rum. The earliest surviving record of rum, in a 1651 document from Barbados, describes it as rumbullion, alias killdivil, a hot, hellish, and terrible liquor. By the late 17th century, rum had replaced French brandy as the exchange alcohol in the Atlantic slave trade. Rhode Island distillers made extra-strength rum specifically as slave purchase currency. Estimates of rum consumption in the American colonies before the Revolutionary War. Every man, woman, and child drank an average of 3 imperial gallons per year. The British Molasses Act of 1733 was so widely violated that enforcement was near zero. The stricter Sugar Act of 1764 has been identified as one possible trigger of the American Revolution. Colonial rum was not just a drink. It may have fueled independence. When the British Royal Navy captured Jamaica in 1655, they switched their daily seaman's ration from French brandy to Jamaican rum. The Caribbean product became literal fuel for the empire's warships. Then there was allspice. The English coined the name in 1621 for a single berry that seems to combine cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove. It isn't a blend, it is one fruit. Jamaica remains the world's leading source. Here is the strange part. Allspice seeds can only germinate after passing through a bird's digestive system. Every attempt to grow pimento from seeds outside Jamaica failed. The plant was locked to the island by biology. Only once scientists identified the avian requirement could allspice successfully establish elsewhere. And tamarind. The word is Arabic, tamar hindi, meaning Indian date. Native to Africa, it reached the Americas when Spanish and Portuguese colonizers brought it in the 16th century. Today, tamarind appears in Trinidad's doubles chutney and Jamaican tamarind candy, and in Worcestershire sauce and HP sauce. The condiments of the British Empire, flavored by the colonies that built it. The food that emerged from 5 centuries of collision did not stay in the Caribbean. Around the 1960s, Caribbean entrepreneurs began cutting oil barrels lengthwise, adding ventilation holes and hinged lids. The oil drum grill brought the mountain pit onto the street corner. Jerk chicken now appears wherever a significant Caribbean diaspora exists. Britain, Canada, the United States, Panama, Honduras. In September 2015, the Jamaican government trademarked Jamaica jerk as a geographical indication, analogous to France's legal protection of champagne. Jamaica was the first country in the English-speaking Caribbean to register a GI, a technique born in Taíno pits and kept alive underground by Maroons, was now protected by intellectual property law. In Barbados, the national dish is cuckoo and flying fish. Cuckoo is cornmeal and okra, with near-identical cousins in Angola, called funge, and in Ghana, called banku. The enslaved West Africans brought their staple grain to Barbados and never gave it up. By tradition, cuckoo is still served on Fridays in homes across the island. Johann Gottlieb Benjamin Siegert, a German army surgeon in Simón Bolívar's forces in Venezuela, developed a medicinal bitters in 1824 in the town of Angostura, named for the first narrowing of the Orinoco River. In 1875, his sons moved production to Port of Spain, Trinidad. As of 2024, bitters represented 8% of Trinidad's entire food and beverage export market. Scotch bonnet peppers measure between 100,000 and 350,000 Scoville units, roughly 40 times hotter than a jalapeno. They spread so thoroughly through the Columbian Exchange that many consumers in Asia and Africa are unaware chili peppers originated in the Americas. So, why does Caribbean food taste the way it does? The allspice was always there, locked to the island by birds. The Scotch bonnet was always there, carried north in Taíno canoes. The underground pit survived British armies by leaving no smoke. What the Caribbean provided was pressure. Every empire that crossed those trade winds left an ingredient behind, sometimes willingly, mostly not. The Africans brought ackee. The indentured workers brought curry. The Portuguese left salted cod. The Dutch left a cast-iron pot. The Germans left a bottle of bitters named for a Venezuelan river. The Caribbean was not a place where spice routes ended. It was the place where they all arrived at once, collided, and were forced, by the people who had no choice but to be there, into something new. The Taíno who built the first jerk pit are mostly gone, but the smoke is still rising. What other flavors are hiding in plain sight? In dishes, the whole world eats. From origins, the world has forgotten.